Hello, everybody, and welcome to the South Dakota Forest Health Workshop Series. I am your moderator, Tony Seidel, and we're joined, as always, by your host, Dr. John Ball. Today, we also have a special guest, South Dakota agroforester Nathan Kafer is joining us. I imagine we'll hear from him a little bit later as we discuss today's topic, windbreaks. And I'm curious to know, one, where you're joining us from, and two, what you call a windbreak where you're from. We have a number of names for them, windbreaks, shelter belts. I'm curious. So in the chat box, put where you're from and what you might call a tree belt where you're viewing from. So we're thrilled to have you here. This workshop is being recorded. We're going to put the recording online for later viewing. By viewing this live workshop, you will be eligible for both Society of America Forester Certified Forester credits and International Society of Arboriculture Certified Arborist credits. Stay tuned to the end of the meeting for your certified arborist code. If you are a certified forester for the SAF, please put your credentials in the chat box sometime during today's discussion. We are working into August here. Things are getting busy, so we decided to move the workshop to the beginning of the month. So thanks for your flexibility on that. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Ball. Dr. Ball, this floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Tony. And we'll kick this up. I'll get to the first one here if I can. There we go. There we are. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And Tony, we're going to come back to you at the end of this and find out what was the name. This is almost like a David Letterman, what do we call it? And this topic may be a little different to some of you. I could see the names, and a lot of folks that work in the urban forest, we call it urban and community forest, work a lot in residential commercial settings. But I've gone and done a lot of workshops on windbreaks over the last few weeks, and people said, boy, is there any way to get this in a recording? Well, this isn't the exact talk, but it's close. So we want to make sure we get some information out there. And I'm sure for a lot of you, this is probably just good stuff to know. A lot of the conservation district people that are attending, obviously this is critical to know. A reminder now for those who are watching this and at the end are going to fill out their form, self-reporting, that they attended this for the International Society of Arboriculture CUs. A reminder at the very end, I will have the exact title of this session, which you must write, and also the CU number. So we'll take that at the end. Again, my name is John Ball. I'm the Forest Health Specialist for the South Dakota Department of Ag and Natural Resources, and also professor here at South Dakota State University. Today, we're also going to be joined during the session by Nathan Kafer, who is the agroforester with the same department. And him and I work quite closely on windbreaks, and we chat a lot to make sure we are giving the same message to everybody. And so there was no way that I wanted to do this today without Nathan's involvement and in interest. And so a little bit later on, he'll be popping in, but he also has these slides in front of him. So, and I told him jump in at any point, but a little bit later, there's a couple of slides that we're going to really count on him discussing. So what we're going to go through today is really some of the key things for establishing and maintaining windbreaks. We're not covering the whole subject, of course, but we're going to cover some of the kind of key items that both Nathan and I have seen have been roadblocks, if you will, for a successful establishment of a windbreak. So with that, let's get started. I had to throw this slide in. Again, forest health specialist, so I go around and look at, well, why is it dead or dying? And I can tell you that when I'm standing out there with a producer, one of the most common things that had to be the nursery's fault. Now, by the way, this is a picture of the Big Sioux Nursery in Watertown, South Dakota. It is a nursery that almost all the conservation districts use to obtain their nursery stock, as well as districts outside the states. Very well-known nursery, very well managed, and they do an excellent job. And while anyone's capable of making a mistake, the mistakes they make are very few and far between. So while it's an easy point well, I must have gotten bad stock. It's actually the last thing to be looking at because it is a very, very, very rare occurrence. They do an excellent job there of taking care of their material. By the way, in selecting their material, they keep good information, excellent information, I should say, on seed sources for everything. And they also have a great means of tracking it all. If you look at their boxes, the number in that box tells them everything. And it's an excellent box. And by the way, I appreciate the fact that Big Sioux Nursery actually maintains their stock during the winter in these excellent boxes that really help trap moisture so we don't dehydrate the plants, desiccate them during the winter. And they hold it just below freezing, which is one of the best ways to maintain bare root stock during the winter. Some of our stock does desiccate. It's kind of like fish. You keep them in there and you keep them above freezing, they will spoil. And so if you're able to keep them slightly below freezing, the ideal is about 28 degrees, and all the studies have been done. You can hold stock for quite a long time period. Other nurseries that may be holding stock in the mid 30s or that, well, it's going to not last quite as long. And even 4 month storage, you might find the real sensitive plants. And that would be your birches, your hackberries, your hawthorns. They've literally dried out by then, and survival drops. But the problems usually begin when the stock leaves the nursery. And the best advice I can give you, the longer you can keep it in this box, the better. Again, it is waxed. You need to think within the box rather than outside the box because it's really designed to hold materials for a long time period. Uh, I know everybody wants to open them up, take a look at them, and in many cases you have to, but if you can just pull the plastic back over and leave them in the box as opposed to taking everything out like an early Christmas present, it's far better to maintain the quality of the stock. Now, eventually they are pulled out, and you can see here boxes being stored at one of the conservation district coolers. Now, for them, freezing's not necessary. They're not going to be holding that stock for a very long time period, weeks or months rather than half a year in some cases. So for them, the ideal cooler temperatures are between about 33 and 36 degrees with a very high humidity. And if kept in the box too, that will maintain the freshness of that material for the time period in which the nurseries, the conservation districts are holding their plant materials. But like everything else, we can run into problems. And we did run into this problem last year, not with a Big Sioux nursery, but some of the districts reported that they were getting a lot of mold on their bare root stock. Now, a little bit of surface mold is quite normal. You may find it on even the twigs, or even an occasional leaf that went into storage. But this seemed excessive. And when you get something like this, it indicates that guess what? The temperatures got a little warm during the winter in storage. The humidity wasn't quite there. And so what happens, you're getting a surface mold developing on it, but it tells you that something else went wrong with your plant. So one of the things I always recommend is obviously when the boxes come in, open the boxes, take a look. And if you're seeing something like this, report it up. And so we can take a look and see what the problem might be. And this can occasionally be a storage problem, but as I pointed out, neither of these came from the Big Sioux nursery. So where you obtain the stock is very important as well. And containers are becoming more common as well, popular particularly for replants. But I do want to point out that we do have some trees, Siberian larch, one of my favorites. I know I'm alone in that. But Siberian larch, which is an incredibly tough plant, though it looks like a dead spruce during the summer, hence I'm the only one that likes it. That one is better from container than bare root. So if you're looking at planting these deciduous conifers, container's really the best way to go. But now I'm going to turn it over to Nathan, so you'll hear another voice here in just a moment. And one of the things he really wanted to do, chat about as we got started here, was a little bit on site prep. So the floor is yours, Nathan, and just let me know when we can go back to the additional slides.
All right. So site prep is one of those things that is used in South Dakota for all of our windbreaks, and it's to ensure that the sites are, or the tree belts are able to get established and able to grow. If we don't do that, we usually see a lot of loss in our tree belts or rows, especially. Back when I first started 20 years ago, we used to till the whole area. Of course, when fabric came in, that kind of changed our mindset on how to prep a site. So we've been looking at doing strip tills, especially when we're going to a grass area. There's the number one complaint that we get all the time from landowners is, I've tilled this area, I'm maintaining it, and I got weeds all over the place. What can I do to fix that? Well, usually the go-to thing is herbicide. So then they go out there and they spray, and then they're spraying something that they shouldn't be spraying, and it gets on the trees, and then we lose the trees that way. So we've switched our mindsets from tilling the whole area to doing these strip tills. Strip tills can be anywhere between 8 to 10 foot wide. Depends on your tractor driver, is what I usually say. You plant the trees down the middle, lay the fabric over the trees, and then you're mowing in between the rows. There is no herbicide being used. There's nothing that can possibly damage the trees. You're pulling the weeds possibly around the holes of the trees. If not, there might be a little granular herbicide being used, but nothing that's going to damage your trees. So we're able to get that site prepped really well in regards to that. Other options other than tilling the whole area, and I'm not knocking tilling the whole area, still, if you prefer that, it's still a very valuable way to prep a site. But the other options is mowing an area down and then using Roundup to killing the grass and then coming in and planting that way. A lot of them actually do all three of those together. They'll mow a site, hit the strips with Roundup, and then come back in and till it after that for a nice spring planting. But as most of us know, site prep is kind of the main thing to kind of start off with our windbreak establishment. If you don't quite get that right, then you have troubles as the trees get older and you move forward with your belt. So I just kind of wanted to throw a little bit in there in regards to site prep. If you do that correctly, it makes it a little bit easier getting those belts established. So.
All right. Well, thank you, Nathan. And you'll hear from Nathan again on a number of the subjects we're going to be discussing today, but he's absolutely right. Site prep is critical. We're planting bare root stock out there, of course. And the biggest thing we need to do once we got the site prepped and we're going to put it in the ground is make sure it goes into the ground wet or moist. And some require a little coaxing. Now, this year, this was not necessary. But if you're planting oaks, a tree that I like to see going into windbreaks, hackberries, which are becoming the new ash, and they're getting planted more, and we still see some hawthorns out there. These three trees in particular do not do well when they come from a cooler and go directly to the outside environment, particularly if there's a great difference between the two. In other words, you're in a cooler at 35 degrees and you're planted out and it's 90, and we all know what South Dakota weather can be like. Well, sometimes they essentially just stop. And I've literally gone out and seen these trees that in the midsummer, you can scrape it, it's still green underneath, but no root growth has really developed because these trees really depend on the expanding bud to trigger root growth. And the expanding bud doesn't happen because it was shocked by the extreme changes in temperatures. So if you have a wet, cool spring, which we had throughout South Dakota this year, and I believe it extended in North Dakota as well, you could actually get by without sweating plant materials because they went to a nice transitional environment. But we can't always plan on that. And so to sweat this material, you lay the bundles down in a shade area. Pole barn is nice. Temperatures from 45 to 70 degrees is probably what you're going to see in the spring. Place mulch over the roots and wet that down. Okay. Then cover the entire plant, the entire plant. The roots, the stem, the top, okay, in plastic and kind of seal it at the edges. So what have you done? You've created a little humidity chamber, kind of a transition from that high humidity that you're going to find in the cooler to the lower humidity you're going to find outside. And now you have a gradual transition in temperature as well. Now, in about 5 to 7 days for most trees, you're going to see the buds start to expand. And when the buds start to expand, plant them. The one problem you have with sweating is you can't hold them. Once it starts and that bud starts to expand, you really need to plant them. And that's why for sweating oaks, I usually say, well, let's wait until sometime into April, even early May, because we want the soil temperatures warm enough that once we put them in the ground, they also begin to grow. And what's the ideal day for planting? It's the worst day for your crew. Hot, sunny, and windy is not what we want. Conifer planting's best at temperatures below 65, and they're a no-go above 75. And wind speeds less than 20 miles an hour and no-go at 30. Let me show you this to kind of illustrate that point. And again, we need warm soil temperatures too. Look at this. This is South Dakota, Scotch pine, bare root, and look at the mortality. If you're looking at 100% mortality in that, well, you do it on a hot, sunny day, only 73 degrees, and you've exposed those roots for about what? A little over an hour. And nobody here's surprised at that. But what I want you to take a look at, 2 minutes exposure. 2 minutes exposure, cloudy days, not that hot, 50% mortality. Now for conifers, it's a little higher. So on many of our hardwoods, it wouldn't quite be this high. But nevertheless, it's a pretty good indicator that when you're planting that bare root plant, it's got to be planted and watered as quickly as possible, because one of the big mortality factors actually occurs right at planting. Okay, it's not an insect or a disease. It's the fact that that tender root system has been exposed to the environment for longer than, as you can see here, a minute. A minute. So keep them moist. Now, you don't want to put them in a tub of water. A slurry works nice. If you want to use some of these gels, you can do that. What the gels do is they do keep it moist around the roots and keep them covered. So it's that. A mud slurry will work just as well, or water, but make sure they do not go dry before going into the ground. And the soil temperatures. I don't like to see material go in the ground too early. What happens there, if it goes in the ground at less than 45 degrees, let's say somehow someone out and did some bare root planting and it was 40 degrees, soil temperature, you're not going to get any root growth. But what's going to happen is everything above the ground is now prone to desiccation injury. Why? If we get a sunny day, it's going to be warm for that top. If we get a windy day, which for South Dakota is a normal day, we're going to lose more moisture. So you literally could take a bare root tree, okay, take a maple, for example, and you plant it out there in a 40-degree temperature, soil temperature. The roots are not going to grow, but it's going to give off moisture through its stem and through its buds. Conifers, it's even worse. So 46 to 60 degrees, that's pretty good uptake. To me, 50 degrees is when you want to start getting them in the ground, and 61 to 75 is the sweet spot. By the way, our soil temperatures were in the sweet spot for a long time this spring, and we had adequate moisture. So I did not get the typical complaints I do about tree failures. Did they happen? Absolutely. But the conditions for establishment this spring were just perfect. Now, by the way, above 76 degrees for soil temperature, then it's the reverse. You get decreased growth and uptake. And greater than 100, you're essentially killing the roots. But again, these are soil temperatures. I do write those up in the pest alert that goes out in the spring. Well, it goes out every week during growing season. And in the spring, I also track soil temperatures, giving people an idea as, well, hey, we're getting close to the 50-degree mark. You may want to start out and get planting. Well, then you also need moisture. And unfortunately, a lot of years, and the last 2 years were really hard on plants because we really didn't have a lot of moisture. This year we did. But I hate to see it when a belt goes in and no one came up with a watering plan, because we're often left with something like this. And the question is, why'd my tree die? Well, let's see. If you haven't had any rain in a month since you planted it, that's why your tree died. A good rule of thumb is add at least a pint of water, pint to a quart, to each seedling at planting. That is absolutely a requirement for good establishment. That you put the plant in the ground and you water it at least with a pint, somewhere to a pint to a quart, as quickly as you can. In fact, studies have been done and published in Tree Planters Notes have showed that is the biggest thing you can do to improve survival of those seedlings going in. The next part's a little tougher. Water every day for 2 weeks. Now, maybe we're going to get rains, and that certainly happened this year. But I know of years where we didn't have rain for a month after planting, nothing measurable, and the mortality increases. So watering once a week, that's better than nothing, but as much as you can for those first 2 weeks, if you can get out there and water them with a little bit of water every day, that's far better than a lot of water once. And the reason for that is most of that water is going to either evaporate off or run off or leach in, will not be utilized by the plant. So 16 ounces of water. Look at that. This is the first study in 1995. Increased growth 30%, reduced mortality by 25%. Now we are getting more that are going to irrigation systems. Drip irrigation is getting a little bit more common. And if Nathan's sitting there in the room still, I'd like his thoughts on irrigation and trickle irrigation, and if he's seeing it more. I'm seeing a little bit of it, not a lot, but I'm encouraged by the fact I'm seeing it more. So Nathan.
Yeah, we are seeing it a lot more. We got a lot more conservation districts that are interested in putting them in.
Some people on the call from all over the United States.
Yeah, so we do see a lot more interest in it, and it is something that you can definitely maintain your belts with those. Get out there and be able to water them. They can be set up completely or different for each belt. They can be gravity fed or powered by a pump that you have out there. But we are seeing a lot more interest. The ones that have put them in, we see great survivability of the trees. Again, like Dr. Ball said, there's not much moisture or water that is needed for these young trees. A lot of people think when they go out there that we got to give them 2-3 gallons of water, where you don't, not for the little trees. Now, if it was, again, an urban planting, yeah, then you would be looking at that. But for shelter belts, new plantings, conservation stock, yeah, little water is needed, and that's why the irrigation systems are really useful.
And he's absolutely right. It's a little water. We're talking ounces, 16 ounces or so, and on a more frequent basis. And
Yep.
That's what trickle can do.
Yeah. So.
Okay. And then fabric. And Nathan and I could spend days on fabric. Fabric, I love it. Okay. It's a fantastic thing to do. But a couple of things. First of all, if someone's put the fabric down over the trees, pulling the slit and bringing them up through, don't leave the trees under the fabric more than 5 minutes, particularly if it's a hot day, because essentially you're baking them. But fabric is kind of critical. However, make sure you got a large enough hole around it. By hole, we'll talk about how to make the slits, because I have seen it where people have flaps of the fabric actually leaning on that little seedling. And look at this white spruce, what we call Black Hill spruce. 50% foliage damage when exposed to 118 degrees for 30 minutes. And you think 118 degrees? Oh yeah, look at this one. I actually went out and measured it. We were hitting 110. And by the way, one of the things I really like to see is the fabric flat to the ground. Because some studies have looked at, if you've got an air bubble between the fabric and the soil, that really heats up that air. And Nathan, what about stapling in that? Oh, by the way, I should let people know the picture of the white fabric there. That was set up to see, well, could we keep it a little cooler? We could, but white fabric, that puffiness is from all the weeds that came up underneath it because it allowed light to penetrate. But what about stapling to make sure we've got that held to the ground, Nathan?
Yeah, so most of the time when fabric is laid, conservation districts come back with staples. And you could use rocks, you could use logs or anything like that. Staples are pretty cheap. And what normally you see is you'll see a staple in between the trees. So whatever your distance are between the trees, you'll have one in between, and then you'll have usually one by the tree itself. And that can do two things. That keeps the fabric down around the tree. And then also, like in this picture here, you have the flap. That flap can be tucked under, and then you can staple it through. Now, staples are used to keep the fabric down as well, but as most of us know, that's as South Dakota, the winds blow, that staple comes up. So again, it's on the landowner or the producer to go out there as they should be, checking the belt. And if they see a staple up, just push it back down. They're usually pretty easy to push in there. In past times, we have used staples along the edges, but nowadays with a lot of the different fabric machines out there that have been fine-tuned, they work pretty well of keeping those edges down, keeping that soil up on there so we're not seeing anything blowing up or anything like that. So in most cases, it usually takes about two staples per tree, and then you're good to go. And then we're not having an issue with that flap coming up.
And that's a key thing. And yes, they do kind of rise. Just walk through. You can push them down with your foot. But, one of the problems with fabric was that in the beginning, we were all told it would break down. And it does if it's exposed to sunlight. So around deciduous trees like this, where the sun is reaching the ground, they do degrade. Not right away, but slowly. And what's nice, they degrade enough that as the tree trunk continues to expand, the fabric tears. And so with deciduous trees you're seeing in here, I'm not worried about them being girdled by the fabric. However, quite different with conifers. In fact, this was a belt that both Nathan and I went to quite a few years ago. But as you can see, we're getting some discoloration here of the cedars, the junipers. And I think the age was about 10 to 12, somewhere in there, because that is the time we get it. And when I crawled underneath there, which I'm willing to do East River, but not West River, we got snakes there. I was able to pull it, and I couldn't pull it out completely from the trunks of the trees. This is another one. This was spruce, but the same way. Part of that was literally embedded in the trunks of the trees. So Nathan, I talk about your experience too, because for me, the classic is it's a conifer and it's been in the ground anywhere between about 8 to 12 years. And then they start noticing some along the row are becoming discolored.
Yeah, that's about what I see. You'll see 3 or 4 in a row, and they'll be changing color. And we'll get that call then and say, hey, what's wrong? Go out there. Of course, we do everything, and then we're like, well, do you have fabric on this? And most of the time you got to dig pretty deep to find it because there's so much soil over top, or needles, or other debris, or more grass growing on there because there was so much soil. And then you find that fabric, and then you try to see if you can put a finger in between the trunk of the tree and the fabric, and in most cases you don't. And in most cases we see it going into the tree, and then that kind of tells us on why that tree's failing. It's just the fabric is starting to girdle it. So I probably run into it anywhere between 2 to 3 times a year.
Yeah. And this is a perfect one, if we can use that term. Notice here, nice belt, grassed in along the sides. And what I notice is we're just having, typically you'll have 2 or 3 in a row, but sometimes individually, and they were just declining. Now, what's interesting, and Nathan just mentioned it too, in this case, I had to dig 2 inches down through sod. Okay. I mean, the fabric was literally buried into the ground, and they had made a small slit to it. And that fabric, which had been underground now for 10 years, looked as good as the day it went in. It would not tear at all. and it was girdling these trees. So the other thing too is try to keep the soil from blowing in over the fabric. That'll help too. We do want it to break down in time. Now, check it. Absolutely check it by year 4. And then, if you can, consider pulling it in year 5 or 6, not age 10 or 12 if you can avoid it. And here's why. I have seen when people have gone in there and they're now losing trees, rip and pull all the fabric out at year 12. By year 12, all the roots are right beneath the fabric. And if you hit a drought year, you'll lose even more trees. And so, Nathan, same thing about year 5 and 6, if
Yeah.
possible.
Yeah, and it's easier to remove then versus that 10 and 12 as well. Getting out there and doing it now, or around that year 5 and 6, just makes it so much easier on you when you need to get stuff done in there. So yes, I agree.
You know what? And by then the fabric's done its job. You need it to establish. If Nathan and I could invent a fabric that would completely disappear in 5 years, we could retire. Musk would be our buddy because we'd be bringing in that much money. All right, so how do we avoid that? The biggest thing is, what are you going to do? You don't make a slit anymore and pull the seedling up. We try to make a J, an L, an X, about 12 inches across. And the reason being is then you can actually have it so that it'll probably tear a little bit more. And it's also large enough that it's going to take more time for the trunk to actually end up hitting the fabric. And by then the fabric hopefully is broken down enough. So these sort of things where you're doing this again, and here's a good example of what Nathan mentioned, even though it's on a deciduous tree. See where the staple is? What did they do with the staple? They stapled the flap down. So they didn't have any problem with having the flap end up touching the trunk of the tree. All right, tubes. I'm a big fan of tubes. I love tubes, fabric and tubes. And if you're going to plant an oak or a hackberry, it almost should be a requirement that you're going to tube those trees. Well, there's a lot of advantages to tube. You do create a mini greenhouse. Anyone that's ever planted oaks and tubes have been amazed at that growth. But keep in mind, these tree tubes, or tree shelters as they're called, were really first developed in Europe. England was the big one. And they were for deer. And that's why if you're planting oaks or hackberries, which is like candy to deer, if you really expect them to grow, you want to tube them. So let's spend a little time on tubes. I'm going to let Nathan chat here just a bit, not really on all the tubes, but one of the things you need to do is support the tube. So Nathan, talk about what you would use to support it. I've got it on the slide later for those that need it, but go ahead.
So when we first started doing tubes, as most of us know, tubes come with a bamboo shoot, more or less. Put that in the ground and you're good to go. Well, not really. Those things break really easily. Usually we take those and just throw them in the dumpster. The next option was oak stakes. Oak stakes are good. Their stability is good. They work well. Problem is they will rot, and usually they rot right at the ground level. And then you see the tree or the tube break, or the deer come over, knock them over, and break up your tree from there. So the next option was, we'll go with a T-post. T-post, yes, will be there. The problem with it is they're going to be so sturdy that any buck or deer will come up to it, they'll rub on it, they'll stay on it, and all they're going to do is damage your tube and damage your tree as well, because it's a nice sturdy spot for them to rub their antlers. So the option, it's like, what can we actually use? Well, we actually found that PVC, fiberglass, something like that, that flexes with the tube, works really well. So if a deer comes up, starts rubbing on it, it's not something sturdy there for them to stay there and keep doing it. They get frustrated, they move on. They don't usually damage the tree, and then the tree's perfectly fine, and you're still got the tube on the tree. We've seen PVC. We've had some conservation districts here in South Dakota use PVC water pipes to put the tubes in. Green stakes is one that we've been looking at. We do have that in our in the NRCS tech notes as well. Those come in all different sizes. They're not as sturdy, but they're a cheap, easy way to get your tubes out there. There are some great fiberglass ones that come with tubes now. Those work really well. And then if you're using a little bit shorter tube, electrical fence post works really well. They go in the ground really easily, and they're actually really flexible as well. So there are some options other than the first three I discussed.
Great. All right. Well, this is a fantastic picture, people. By the way, this is it was a great belt. The producer was doing everything that could be done to maintain this. But what you can see here is, oh, look at the little tree sticking out of the tubes. And when I went out there, I noticed this, and it was a perfect study, though it wasn't intended for this. What the producer had was about a third of the rows had no tubes. Then a third had 4-foot tubes. And then another third had 5-foot tubes. The oaks and the hackberries, because he had both in there, without tubes, after years, looked like this. And last week, I was out looking at a windbreak, and the producer said, how come these hackberries aren't growing? And I looked, and they're this tall, and they're wider than they are tall. And you could see where they had been browsed, the tear cuts that deer make. So here was the ones without tubes. There was the ones with the 4-foot tubes. Deer can eat 4 feet easily, and essentially it's like an ice cream cone. And then you see down the row with the 5-foot tubes. Now, yes, deer can reach 5, but they don't as often. And so those 5-foot tubes, we actually had trees growing. Now, Nathan, I think you said even 6-foot tubes. How available are those? I see a lot of 5s. I don't see 6. I'd have no problems with 6 if people could get them.
I think it's 5's more available right now, and I think I don't know how many people have actually looked into 6, but I think most of our conservation districts here in South Dakota do have a 5-foot tube. So
yep, and the 5-foot, absolutely don't bother with the 4. Like I said, you've just created ice cream cones for them. They don't even have to bend down to get it. And again, here's the oaks. If you want another example, oaks and hackberries. If you said, "Gee, I want to bring more deer into my windbreaks," plant those. Oh, and then have a cedar belt too, just so they can hide in it. But look at the 4-foot here, and then look at the entire row there. 4-foot tubes. So 5-foot tubes, essential for these trees. But all trees actually do better in tubes. But look at the 5-footers. Now, even the NRCS notes mention this. 5-foot tubes or greater for deer protection. And I really recommend it. The other thing is leave them on as long as you can. Don't remove the tubes until the canopy is above the top for several years. Wait 3 or 4 years. You can actually wait until the trunk almost fills it. Because the problem is, and here's a good example, they pulled the tubes off these, and when they pulled them off, everything just bent over. Okay, and so the stem has not been able to gain any strength. And if you let the top grow above it, it's going to sway a little bit. And that swaying helps strengthen the trunk. So here we got a whole bunch of nice tubes going in, but we have a problem with tubes. And this was a belt, and I've seen it, and I'm sure Nathan's seen it.
Yep.
I'm going to ask him in just a moment. But what I was amazed at is one of the producers did this. Now, by the way, that was a tree that had been scraped before he put the foam tubes. And what he did is he put this foam and glued it with Gorilla Glue around the top of each, because if you don't do this or do something, sooner or later that wind's going to move the tree and it's going to hit the side of the tube. So Nathan, what other solutions do you have to prevent the sort of damage to trunks?
So there are tubes out there that do have a rolled top to them, and those seem to help a little bit. It's not still a solve all fix all. You'll still get a little damage off there. That's about the best we've seen. I was just at a site here about a week ago where the producer actually had tubes just like the one on the picture here, and he actually rolled the tops himself. There's still a little damage to the tree, but it wasn't much. It was a lot less than the tubes that were like this. So doing something like this, I thought was a really good idea. It is time consuming, of course. You got to definitely have a producer that's willing to go out there and do that. But there are tubes out there that do have a flared top to them. So then when that tree rolls within the wind, it doesn't hurt them at all. So, but yeah, like I said, the tubes are not a solve all fix all, but they are just another tool that we can use to establish our windbreaks.
And again, and reduce our deer damage.
Yeah.
And again, the ones that are rolled at the top work as well, but this is something you do have to consider because you do want to leave the tree in there long enough that the trunk is strong enough that it's not going to bend over, which means you can get damage like this. So foam, rolled, trim them yourself, but you're going to have to do something at some point to prevent this. Okay, now the other thing, tubes taller than 4 feet or taller, according to NRCS, they want them vented. Okay, and I see a lot of vented tubes out there. Now, the tube manufacturers usually say they want the vents along the middle and upper side, but as Nathan and I have talked about, it seems like most manufacturers have the holes all the way along. So it's not just limited to the top or bottom. What you're trying to do is get airflow going through there. That airflow will help. One of the biggest things it helps with is hardening off. The early tubes, one problem we had, and I even remember seeing it in cottonwoods, it created such a wonderful little mini greenhouse. The trees didn't shut down in time in the fall. And believe it or not, we had winter injury on cottonwood. So the old idea, and by this, I'm talking about 1992, was to lift the tube, put a little stick underneath it, get that air flowing through it in the fall, and then push it down. Otherwise, you created a little nest. Nowadays, instead, we use this. And by the way, this is a guy that used T-post. And as Nathan mentioned, he already had some that the deer had found. And since it's hard, they had just shredded the tube as they're rubbing up to the air. And I think I had another picture there. There's another one. Any comments on this? Oh, by the way, Nathan, before you comment, I get asked this, and it's okay to do, people. If you get too much foliage and branches, stems in there, you can lift the tube and prune off suckers. Do that before bud break in the spring. But any other tube advice?
Yeah, I like ventilation all the way throughout the tube. And I think you can still find those out there. But any type of ventilation is still good. It is still talked about lifting tubes, putting something underneath of it to get that airflow. We've seen a lot of damage on honey locusts and basswood in regards to that as well. So going out there again, doing a little maintenance in regards to that, and then once they've hardened off for the winter, going back out there, removing whatever you have underneath there, put them back down, so then we don't have any bunny issues after that. Works great. But yeah, and then we still, I still say you can do some pruning with them, even with the tubes on as well. So.
Yep. Just lift up the tube, do a little pruning, and you're done. Now, by the way, Nathan mentioned a real important point there. Notice what he said, honey locusts and basswoods. And remember, I mentioned cottonwoods. And the point of that is these are trees that have what we call indeterminate growth. They continue to grow as long as conditions are favorable. That doesn't happen with oak. Oak will shut down at a certain point. They have a determinate growth as well as some other species. So this can be very much species dependent as to whether or not you need to raise the tubes or not. But that was a very good point regarding the honey locust. And by the way, deer like honey locusts as well. So once again, I think the advantages of tubes outweigh the difficulty, and like everything else, fabric included, this all requires a little maintenance work. It's not just you put everything in and walk away. Well, we're going to spend about the last 10 minutes or maybe 5, so I'll go through this kind of quickly. And I might add too, we will be having this fall based upon the research we've done over the last few years, a fact sheet that will cover this information in a lot more detail, pictures and a lot of other things, because these are some of the most common questions that we get asked, is what to do about weeds. And today we're going to talk about one specific thing. Now, weed control is necessary, and we'll chat about how to do that. But what we want to talk about today, because this is establishment as well as maintenance, is carryover. And it's one of the things the districts have been more and more attuned to, watching for that. This is a cedar that was a replant. The windbreak was planted year 1, all the cedars died. Year 2, they planted it, cedars were dying again. Now, interesting enough, the cherry row, they looked fine. And this belt looked perfect. By that, I could even see a little corn stubble. It was perfectly flat. And I said, what was in here the year before? Well, it was corn. Said, did you use atrazine? And the answer was yes. Atrazine can have at least 3 years of carryover. So one of the things everyone has to do is take a look at what was used the season before the planting was done. And I'm really happy now because both Nathan and I, and we confer on these. You know, we get where people say, well, hey, I used this. Well, okay, they used triple flexor. That's got 2 years worth of carryover. Atrazine, at least 2 years of carryover. Cornerstone, no issue. And obviously with these surfactants of that, there's no interest as well. But we need to know this information, or the district needs to know this information. The producer, absolutely, before they decide whether or not they can plant and what they plant. And we'll try to be a little bit more conservative. I prefer the 3rd year for planting for atrazine, but sometimes you can get away with 2 depending on soil conditions. But this is something that you do have to watch. And so we're going to have this as a lot more detailed information in the brochure. But here's some common products used for soybeans and the chemicals in them. And what you're looking at is the carryover. Now, take a look at this authority or broad axe, 3 years. And by the way, for dicamba, it can take 2. Now, a reminder to everyone, what we're talking about is carryover. This is soil applied herbicide that remains in the soil and is active. And then when you plant your trees, affects them. We're not talking about a drift. That'll be a whole nother subject and a whole nother webinar. But here's one. And in fact, Nathan, I know you might not remember this one, but this was the site you had me come to, I think it was last year.
Yep.
Okay. If you remember, tell people about this one.
So this is a belt I actually set up. I designed it. It had the species that you're looking at. It had different types of willows in there because there's a couple low areas. The producer called me about midsummer and was like, hey, I have an area where all my trees are dead. And of course, he was upset because the trees were looking good, but then they all of a sudden started dying. Got out there, took a look, and there was just a nice little swath that went right through the middle of the belt that every row was gone except for the cedars that were on the north side. And we got this look, disformed leaves, small leaves, yellowing to almost whitish leaves coming out. So I got looking at all the trees. I also saw a couple over by an old house that he had, went over there and looked at those, doing the same thing. So I contacted Dr. Ball, had him come out. Just by looking at it, I knew it had to be some spray issues. But of course, we don't say it is. Of course, it's got to be. It looks possible as spray damage. So until we get something done and we can take a look at it.
Yep.
Came out. I think we took 2-3 bags full of
Yep.
leaves off of these trees that were still there. And then I let Dr. Ball run from there. So,
yep. And again, we can pick this stuff up. Now for corn, here's some atrazine. Atrazine is one of your longest lightning too. I might mention, this is important, everyone. Hornet, for example, 2 years. But one of the producers brought in a product, and I'll just call it Hornet, But they said, well, they're using Hornet Plus. And again, I'm just making up that additional name. Well, guess what? That had a different chemical in it, despite having the same brand name. And so we had to look at that one to make sure. And here's the soil carryover on cedars. You can see the adjacent corn stubble, and that killed every one of them. I was able to pull out 112 parts per billion of atrazine from an application made 18 months earlier. Pastures, because we do see those, milestone, particularly on legumes. And it's surprising how many people don't realize honey locust is a legume. Same with pea shrub. And so they can be affected. And take a look at Grazon and Tordon, 3 years. And I was out, here was a belt that went into pasture area that had been treated with Tordon. And if you take a look at all the trees. Now, that never grew. They put it in the ground and it died right away. But when we tested the tissue, that came out and was there. It was amazing how much we pulled out. So, not only do we have drift issues, but the other issue people forget about is what was used on that soil the year before planting. And again, with some chemicals, it can take 3 years before that residual is down to the point that planting is safe. And for some, you can plant the next year. And the soil type, moisture, those are all factors that have to be in consideration as well. Well, with that, we're just about at the close of time, and we're not done yet, but a reminder to everybody, Windbreak 101 Establishment and Maintenance Tips. The ISA CU code, and that's only important for those of you that have watched this that are also looking to get your CU credit for doing the live session. It's DS-24-018. So I'll leave this up so people can write that down. But I'm going to ask Tony. Tony, first of all, I love the idea you did a survey. What's the results of your survey? And then do we have any questions to Nathan and myself?
Well, it looks like the uh, front runner was clearly shelter belts. Uh,
Oh, okay.
I was thinking so, and I imagine um, the right setting makes the difference too, whether it's a shelter belt or a windbreak or what you have. So, yeah, shelter belt was the front runner for sure. One more reminder for any SAF credentials before we sign off here. I did have a couple of questions come through. If you're ready, Dr. Ball. And
I think Nathan and I are ready.
perfect. Well, Kathy has a shelter belt that's about 6 years old and it's deteriorating. She's curious if there's an efficient way for removing it or whether you just leave it alone. She noted that the plastic has been trimmed away in the past.
Okay. Well, we probably would need more information, and maybe this is something that you just need to email us about. And that is, if it's deteriorating, well, the first question would be, well, why is it deteriorating?
Yeah.
What's the factor? Are we looking at a soil issue? I have seen some in too low a sites. Was it planted in properly? And I'm not saying it was, but these are all factors. What species are being affected? But we probably need more information because I'd hate to see it just ripped out and replanted and the same thing happens. And I have seen that in the past. So we need to figure out what's wrong with this belt before you rip it out and plant a new one. Nathan, what would you say?
I completely agree, especially since it's only 6 years old. Most of our shelter belts, especially in South Dakota, 40 years is usually we get a good growth out of them, and then we start seeing them decline. But being at 6 years, I completely agree. A lot more information will be needed to determine on why the belt has started to fail, why it's deteriorating, and then we can go from there and give you a better suggestion.
And it may require a site visit from either of us or both of us. Sometimes the best way is on the ground. All
Well,
right.
perhaps I misunderstood the question because Kathy
Oh,
chimed in that the trees are actually doing fine. It's the plastic that is deteriorating. She's curious to remove all the plastic. I misread.
oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Well, we did answer a good question there properly, and that is we got to figure out why. But in this case, we do know the why, and that's the fabric. Hey, Nathan, it's deteriorating. What would you do? Would you pull it
So
out or leave it if it's
If it's deteriorating, I would leave it and let it keep deteriorating.
Yeah.
Um, because you got enough sunlight getting down there, getting to it. You'll be perfectly fine. There will be no issues with there. The trees will be able to still establish. It can, yes, be a little unsightly, but you can go in there and do a little trimming of it to make it look a little bit better. But especially if it's a bigger belt. There's probably a lot more work that will go into it. But my idea would be just kind of leaving it for now. Might need to do something down the road, but yeah, if it's deteriorating, just leave it in the belt.
And I would too. And hopefully it's a belt nobody sees,
Yeah.
because I have seen them where they kind of shred and particles fly a little bit in that. But if it's hardwoods, that is what happens, is it does deteriorate and ends up very spotty and falls apart. The biggest problem I've seen with this, Nathan, is okay, it's deteriorating, so it's getting grassed in, and the producer mows it and catches some of the fabric in the mower.
Yep.
And that. So yeah, maintenance.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that'll pull it out. All right. And thanks for the clarification. Okay, Tony, any others?
How about tree spacing? There's a question from Perry about tree spacing and how that varies between tree species even.
I like that question, and that's worthy of an entire session itself, because this has been Nathan and my big complaint. And I'll start out with one comment, and I'm going to turn Nathan loose on this one. And that is, when I first started here back in the 90s, I was seeing spruce going in on 8-foot spacings. And what you find is they deteriorate very quickly. When spruce get to the point where they're growing into each other, that's when they start to decline. I like 16 feet. I'm not as critical on some hardwoods as I am spruce, but spacing needs to be broad enough. So Nathan, go for it.
And it didn't change when I started in 2004.
Oh my
So,
gosh.
cedars in South Dakota are planted at 6 foot apart. Here's the fun thing. This is how I was told why it was done this way. We treated our windbreaks like our forested area. You plant a bunch of it close together, thinking that some of it's going to die. So then you have trees to replace that. Well, what happened is we took care of the belt so well that none of the trees died. So then the thought was, well, the producer will go out there and remove every other one. So then that will put them at 12 foot apart. People forget we live in South Dakota. If it's green and alive, we don't want to remove it because it took too long to get it there. So we left it. And then what happens there is we have too many trees in such a small area. They choke each other out and they start dying. So then we get the phone call, why is my tree dead? We come out, take a look. It's like, well, they're planted too close. Well, that's not what I was told when I planted these trees. They were, supposed to survive and perfectly fine. It's like, no, this is why it's doing this. So we've changed that over the years. When it comes to shrubs, we do have them anywhere between 4 to 6 foot spacing. Conifers, depending on the conifer, depending on what row they're planted. If they're the first row in a belt, I still don't mind 8 because they're going to be the first ones to stop your snow. Anything after that has to be at least 10 plus. When you get into the taller trees like your spruce, your ponderosa pine, anywhere between 14 and 16, I like those sizes as well. Your taller deciduous trees, you're looking at 12 plus. Your mid-sized trees, you're looking at anywhere between 8 to 10. A lot of conservation districts will go 12 as well with those. So we have bumped the spacing up a couple feet just so we can get a little bit better growth. We've also seen by doing that, when we do have terrible winters, if you have, say, like a conifer in row 2, we're not seeing as much breakage in them with that bigger spacing. The branches are stronger. And then we're actually seeing a lot more survivability during those bad winter years as well. So,
yeah, no, excellent. And that's it. I mean, folks, it depends on the tree. So Perry had that right. And, those broad guidelines there, but we've tried to push that to a little bit wider. I like this. I like the 14 to 16 for the spruce. Absolutely. We can go tighter on the deciduous, but, and on the shrubs, of course, you make a wall, but
yeah.
any last question there, Tony?
I got one last question. I think that's really pertinent, and that's tips for weed control if you're not using fabric or if you were to remove fabric. How would you manage any sort of weed control without fabric?
Without fabric, I think that gets back into what Nathan, well, hang on, I'm not sure. So they're just leaving a bare strip,
Yeah, is
correct?
it better for grass than weeds to have, is the grass influencing the area as much as the weeds do?
I'll tell you one influence I'm seeing this year already. If you have grass or weeds without fabric, is I'm already getting people saying, why are my cedars or picca pines, those are the two big ones, turning color and dying now? And I go out there and they don't have fabric and they've got grass and weeds they haven't mowed, and we've got voles already attacking them. Voles love trees and they love hiding cover. So one other advantage to fabric is you've got an open spot. Voles don't like that. So if you're not going to use fabric, you're going to be mowing a lot, or the other one it used to be was tilling a lot. And with the tilling, one issue you end up throwing soil over the seedling a little bit more, and we actually ended up with them being, quote, planted too deep. In terms of weed control for the hole around that, or weed control for the seedling after it's planted, I think Nathan and I will do a spring webinar just on that subject alone, because there's an awful lot of details to it, more than I can give in 2 sentences.
Yeah, and
That sounds like a plan.
and when it comes to grass and weeds, it's kind of a catch-22 for both. Grass
Yeah.
forms such a root carpet around the trees that when we don't get enough moisture, the trees aren't getting it. Weeds, on the other hand, if you go out there and start pulling it, especially on newly planted belts, if you pull too close to the trees, you're going to rip the trees right out as well. Um, so neither, I would have to say, for in a shelter belt.
That's a good way to end. So, you know what? I hope everybody enjoyed this today. I appreciated Nathan coming in on this. I think Nathan will be my buddy on 2 more. One this winter sometime. Everybody get a hot cup of coffee, settle back, and we're going to talk about our pluses and minuses to the various shelter belt species of trees. So you can get our opinions where we agree and disagree. And then I think a spring, okay, what do we do for weed control in a shelter belt? We'll cover that subject as well. So, Tony, I'll turn it back to you to wrap it all up.
You bet. Thanks, Dr. Ball. Thanks again, Nathan, for joining us this month. And thanks to all those almost 70 people that were watching today. We look forward to seeing you next month. Stay tuned for the invitation there and enjoy your month of August. Thank you.